Fascism makes people see themselves as belonging to the most beautiful and most important thing in the world, the nation. And then people think, well, they taught us that fascism is ugly. But when I look in the mirror, I see something very beautiful, so I can't be a fascist, right? Wrong. That's the problem with fascism. When you look in the fascist mirror, you see yourself as far more beautiful than you really are. In the 1930s, when Germans looked in the fascist mirror, they saw Germany as the most beautiful thing in the world. The greatest danger that now faces liberal democracy is that the revolution in information technology will make dictatorships more efficient than democracies. In the 20th century, democracy and capitalism defeated fascism and communism because democracy was better at processing data and making decisions.
Right. So it's interesting because it's for the first time you could say that, or it's taken almost a century for team democracy, for which Harari stands, to finally admit that fascism actually stood for nationhood, right? Individuals bound together to solve a problem that benefits all citizens. And this is why I think that talk is titled that way, because that's something they want to obscure. It's the forbidden fruit. The Germans didn't see themselves as the most beautiful thing in the world. They're basically trying to get out from under the stranglehold of globalist bankers, right? Who nearly ended their country, by the way, right? So, contrary to what a lot of people are taught, Hitler was actually voted into government by a majority. In fact, at one point, 90% of the population was behind him, right? So, and he delivered what he came into office to promise, which is also categorically ignored by history books.
I'm sorry, Frank, you're not allowed to look at this in a nuanced way. There's only one narrative here, and that narrative is good and bad. Democracy is good because in the name of democracy, we're marching into nations that don't have a central bank yet, and we're bombing them into submission so they have a central bank, which has happened in the last 20 years to the remaining nations that didn't have one. Well, guess what? The wars, did you know, that were about terrorism and whatnot, those were countries that didn't have a central bank, and now they do have a central bank.
Exactly, right? Nationhood, in this case, nationalism, the dirty word, is a threat to democracy, which, by the way, happens to be controlled by globalists, aka liberals. And that was actually, incidentally, John, that was the goal of communism. And its goal, we know from intercepts that were made by Scotland Yard and whatnot in the early 20th century, that their intention was to spread all over the world, communism, right?
And they don't care necessarily about the specific ideology. They look at the vehicle that will bring about what they want, whether that's called fascism or communism or liberal democracy. That's just for us to fight over. They don't care. Whatever does the job, whatever gets the job done, that's what they'll use.
Well, yeah, ultimately, of course, these are labels, and whatever definition we give them, whatever significance we give them is what applies. But, the thing is, originally, the USA was not a democracy, John.
It was a constitutional
republic. And, remember that clip from one of our episodes previously where this former FBI agent, Dan Smoot, I think, he was from the 50s. He was saying basically there's a big difference between democracy and a republic form of democracy, right? So they began systematically dropping off the term republic over the last decades to kind of cunningly and deliberately move us into democracy. So democracy's become a mantra, but democracy is the child of Marxism, right? And most of the liberal ideas that have their roots in Marxist ideology are intended to actually erode the fabric of a healthy society with perversion, hedonism, egotism, self-glorification, the destruction of the male-female family foundations, most of the control, and most importantly, you could say the control of the currency. It always comes down to that, right? And I'm sure it's going to trigger people with cognitive dissonance to be talking about this concept of democracy versus fascism. But I think it's something, that forbidden fruit we should drill down a little bit deeper into, right? Because, first of all, you can't put fascism in the same basket as all forms of fascism, right? But the main objective of fascism, according to the 20th century, according to the countries that adopted that form of government, was intended to be for the well-being of the people, right? If you were an entrepreneur, for example, in a fascist state, fascism will tell you, go ahead, run your business, earn a lot of money, be successful, create jobs, but don't produce products or services which will damage our nation and our people. Be honest, treat your workers and pay them a living wage. And if you follow this simple standards, if you don't follow it, of course, we'll shut you down. That was the point of it in the first place. It was a point where in the 20th century, where communism was making its run to take over Europe. And that's something they don't tell us in the history books, right? They just give us this very, very simplified definition of what fascism is. In fact, I'll put it up. That's something that Time magazine put out there. They call it, fascism is a movement that promotes the idea of a forcibly monolithic, regimented nation under the control of an autocratic ruler, right?
I've heard so many contradicting definitions of fascism. So where do you take yours from? What is the root of that word, and where do you take your definition from?